Greetings, podcast listeners. In this episode, I'll be speaking about the challenges that Mussolini faced after his appointment as Prime Minister in 1922. So let's look at a few challenges that he faced. Firstly, he did not have absolute control, even over the fascist groups such as the Ras and the Squads. As a result, he aimed to increase control over the fascists. With this in mind, in 1923, he created the Fascist Grand Council, which made decisions and later became the main governmental body of Fascist Italy, and a new militia called Milizia Volontaria per la Sicurezza Nazionale, or MVSN, on the 23rd of March 1923. Secondly, his position as Prime Minister was weak and he could easily be dismissed and replaced by the king at any time. However, Mussolini managed to gain the support of the king. This is because the king feared communism, seeing it as, the biggest threat to him, as it would make Italy a republic. As Mussolini was anti-communist, the king supported him. Thirdly, his position as Prime Minister was weak due to a lack of support within the Italian parliament. With this in mind, he introduced the Acerbo law, which would remove proportional representation. The Acerbo law meant that the party which received 25% of votes would receive 2/3 of seats in parliament. The fascists used intimidation to ensure that politicians voted in support of passing the Acerbo law. In the general elections, the fascists used voter intimidation and fraud to ensure that they amassed 25% of the votes after the Acerbo law was passed. The Ras was also instructed to intimidate opponents in small towns. Finally, the Socialists were Mussolini's closest rivals and they still had a significant presence. As a result of this, Mussolini wished to reduce the influence of socialism in parliament and on the nation itself. This attracted a wealth of support from the bourgeoisie, upper class, and businessmen, who especially feared a further advancement of the socialists into communism. He reduced this threat by intimidating socialists and attacking socialist meetings, buildings, and socialist individuals. During voting, he also used the black shirts to intimidate voters, and less people voted for socialists. In November 1922, Parliament granted Mussolini limited emergency powers for 1 year to allow him to deal with the country's problems. During this period, he made some concessions to the church, as he saw their support was vital, and passed favourable policies for industrialists and farmers and landowners. With the extra power he had, he asserted the rights of Italy overseas in the Corfu Crisis and Fiume incident. In July 1923, the Chamber, after being intimidated by black shirts, passed the Acerbo law, which was named after the fascist deputy who introduced it, Giacomo Acerbo. And this allowed the fascists to gain a much larger influence on Parliament and Italian politics in general. Now we move on to the Matteotti Crisis. On the 30th of May 1924, Socialist leader Giacomo Matteotti spoke out against the fascists at the Chamber of Deputies and was immediately met with their interruptions. To put this into perspective, his speech, which was meant to take 30 minutes, lasted for 2 hours because of the fascist interruptions. Following his speech, he told his colleagues that they could prepare for his funeral, and 11 days later, he was kidnapped by ex-quadristi on the way to the chamber, and 2 months later, dogs found his body in a shallow grave 23 kilometers from Rome. The investigation showed that the car that had been seen by passers-by, dropping off his body, belonged to Filippi, a leading fascist. As a result, it became widespread knowledge that Mussolini was implicated in Matteotti's murder, especially with Matteotti being the main political opponent of Mussolini. The Matteotti Crisis had a significant impact. Large protests ensued, with people tearing up fascist member cards and communists calling for a general strike. Meanwhile, in what is known as the Aventine Secession, most opposition deputies walked out of the Italian parliament and met elsewhere, declaring themselves as the true representatives of the Italian people. Their expectation was that the king, Victor Emmanuel III, would dismiss Mussolini. Despite the opinions of many deputies, the elites still believed that a Mussolini government was the best option. While there was hesitation from the opposition, the fascists urged Mussolini to seize control with a fascist dictatorship. At first, Mussolini decided to combine repression and making concessions. He mobilized the militia to crack down on protests and placed tougher restrictions on the press, while he also united the militias with the army, who swore allegiance to the king, and fired the murder suspects Rossi and Chief of Police De Bono as concessions. On the 27th of December 1924, a newspaper published the testimony of Rossi, which directly implicated Mussolini in the murder of Matteotti, and the fascists began to further encourage Mussolini to react, with the Ras, the leaders of fascist militia, pressuring him to do so at a meeting on the 31st of December. On the 3rd of January 1924, Mussolini identified himself as the fascist leader, and announced that he would set up a dictatorship within 48 hours. To conclude this episode, let's begin with the ways that Mussolini and the fascists succeeded in regards to the Matteotti Crisis. He gained increasing control over the whole fascist party. Mussolini's party called on him to take action in a critical meeting on the 31st of December, and his response was satisfying to them as he declared a fascist dictatorship, and this assured them of his power and control. In regards to his rule, he imposed a new policy that mobilized the military and was more strict towards the press. This effectively reduced opposition to the rule of the fascists. By admitting to the murder of Matteotti, to a certain degree, his brutality instilled fear among Italians, and this meant they were willing to obey him and support the fascists. Thus, he was able to solidify his rule over Italy. As he had removed the socialist leader, Giacomo Matteotti, he gained support from the elite, the church, and other right-wing groups that opposed the left and saw socialism and communism as a serious threat. Now, in what ways did Mussolini and the fascists fail in regards to the Matteotti Crisis? Following the Matteotti Crisis, opposing parties still existed and were heavy critics of fascism. Furthermore, he could still be dismissed by the king at any time, but he largely had the support of the king, who was weak and often refused to take action or even criticize Mussolini. In regards to the country, for a time, Mussolini lost a significant amount of Italian support, and they disrespected him for ordering the murder of Matteotti. However, in the long run, this instilled fear and led them to obey Mussolini. Finally, Mussolini conceded in some ways. For example, the fascist militias joined the army and had to pledge allegiance to King Victor Emmanuel III. Also, Mussolini fired those suspected of Matteotti's murder, Rossi and De Bono, who was the chief of police. Well, now it seems we're getting to the stage where Mussolini was almost at the level of dictatorship that Adolf Hitler reached in Nazi Germany. I'd like to know what you think, though. Has Mussolini reached that stage already, or will he ever do so? Let me know with a voice note through Anchor, tweet me on Twitter, or send me a DM on Instagram, all a link below. That's the end of today's episode. Please click subscribe to be notified when the next episode releases. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.